she would be very annoyed if people said, well, it doesn't being a Catholic limit you as a fiction writer, but for her, it was a way of entering into mystery. It was a way of actually seeing something grander than what you just see on the surface.
My friends, welcome to The Literary Catholic, a program where we unpack life-changing stories from centuries of Catholic literature, connecting you to God and inspiring both your faith and imagination.
Hello, I'm Rafael Pi Roman, and with me is Dr. Brent Little. Dr. Little is an associate professor in the Department of Catholic Studies at Sacred Heart University, and his new book, Acts of Faith and Imagination, Theological Patterns in Catholic Fiction, was actually published in 2023 by the Catholic University of America Press. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Little.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
So we're talking about Flannery O'Connor, your favorite author, American author, and mine.
Absolutely.
So let me start from the beginning. Who is Flannery O'Connor, and could you give us a quick summary of the highlights of her life and work?
Sure. So Flannery O'Connor was born in Savannah, Georgia in 1925. She died in 1964 on a family farm outside of Milledgeville, Georgia. People note that that's a very young age, 39, and the reason for that was because of complications of lupus. She did live for a brief amount of time in other states, in Iowa and Connecticut, in fact. But most of her life, and therefore most of her work, was written when she lived on that farm because she needed her mother's assistance. Her father had actually died of lupus. So most of her stories are written under the shadow of knowing that she probably was going to have an early death.
You know, this wasn't always the case, but now and recently, more often than not, when critics speak about her, they always describe her as a Catholic author. Not always, but very often.
Yes.
Just how important was her Catholic faith to her?
It was central, absolutely central. For her, the central dogmas were not a limitation to the fiction writer, but they were a way for the fiction writer to see from a what you might call a transcendent or a bigger frame. So that reality, the material reality, is set against this supernatural reality. So she would be very annoyed if people said, well, it doesn't being a Catholic limit you as a fiction writer, but for her, it was a way of entering into mystery. It was a way of actually seeing something grander than what you just see on the surface.
You know, I was doing research again because I've covered her before. I was doing research again, and I discovered this quote of her talking about what she was attempting to do in her work. And she said, "The novelist with Christian concerns will find in modern life distortions which are repugnant to him, and his problem will be to make these appear as distortions to an audience which is used to seeing them as natural. To the hard of hearing, you shout, and to the almost blind, you draw large and startling figures." What are the distortions that she's talking about?
Yes, so that's one of the most famous lines. So I'm glad you brought that up. And it's from one of her essays. The distortions have to deal with the fact that humanity or American culture has become has lost its sort of moral and spiritual foundation. That has become obsessed with, say, materialism. Even to a certain point, patriotism, that it has become so ego-driven on the human self, that it forgets that human beings are actually very fallen creatures, and that we need God's grace for healing, but a healing that a lot of times happens violently in her stories. Yeah. So then you get these distortions in her works that people thought were mystifying. Why would you write with these kind of characters? But she was trying to reveal what she saw as the moral or the spiritual lukewarmness, you might say, of American culture.
Yeah. Can you give us some examples of these distortions in her work?
Sure. I think the most famous one, and it's one that I remember reading and just being completely mystified by, is A Good Man is Hard to Find. And there you actually see her two main critiques of American life collide. So on one hand, you have the grandmother, who is a self-identified Christian. She references that many times in the story, but it's a kind of a lukewarm Christianity, if you might say. It's more about a spiritual pride, identity, white identity, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have the misfit, who is an escaped convict, And I don't want to give away too much of the story, but while these violent events are going on around them, the two of them have this really bizarre sort of metaphysical debate, where the misfit says, Jesus threw everything off balance. And so if you believe in him, there's nothing to do but to follow him, but basically the misfit doesn't believe in him. Sure. So the misfit, since he doesn't have that spiritual foundation, there's really nothing to life except for having a little pleasure, and that might include killing people.
And he said that the only fun in life is to kill people.
Exactly.
And then, without giving too much away, but we may have to in the course of this conversation. Some violence happens.
Absolutely.
She is shaken. Grace hits her, and she recognizes that spiritual dimension. And then his last words are, "Nothing's fun in this world. Right. Not even killing."
Right.
And
it's a wonderful thing because the reader has to confront, does the misfit change in this interaction or does he not? And I like to think, because based on what you just said, that that's at least a little crack in the shell. There's a little hope there. But of course, that's entirely reader's interpretation.
And that happens a lot in the fiction.
Yeah,
we'll get to that in a second. But, speaking of what you were just speaking about, O'Connor often said that when people asked her what a story of hers meant, she always told them, read the story or reread it, right? But in fact, she did spend a lot of time explaining her work in her nonfiction stuff and in her talks, right? And here's part of what she wrote in a brief introduction that she added to the 10th edition of Wise Blood, her first novel, where the protagonist is Hazel Motes, another weird, distorted character. She says this, that the belief in Christ is to some a matter of life and death has been a stumbling block for readers who would prefer to think of it as a matter of no consequence. For them, Hazel Mote's integrity lies in trying to get rid of that ragged figure who moves from tree to tree in the back of his mind. But for the author, his integrity lies in not being able to do so. So she explains it.
Yes.
But my question is, do you believe that the fact that she felt compelled to spell out her intentions to her readers, like she does here, again and again, that it's evidence that somehow she failed in her attempt to get them to see reality through a Christian lens, through distortions?
That's a great question. Let me set up the context for her, from her point of view now. She was in the South. She's outside of Milledgeville. She's writing about the South. But in her mind, and she's very clear in this in her letter, she's writing for the educated reader who does not believe in God, does not believe in original sin. And that educated reader is oftentimes a northern person. And so she had to, I would say, suffer quite a lot of misunderstanding, not just on the part of these sort of northern critics she had in her mind, but even on part of other Catholics. So your question for me is it's a difficult one to answer, because I think if you're thinking, did she fail in the sense of, is somebody going to pick up that story and come to Christianity the way, say, people describe C.S. Lewis? You pick up Mere Christianity, you read the Narnia stories as a kid, and maybe you can work your way to Christianity. That rarely happened. But having said that, once you tap into the imagination she has, I find it can be so enriching to faith. She was so insistent that she was an Orthodox Catholic. But the way she thought about the orthodoxies of Catholicism, the central dogmas, was so creative and so enriching. And I think it's something that a lot of people maybe never would be exposed of by any other writer.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. And by the way, speaking for myself, I don't mind a little help from the author every once in a while.
I agree with you. I agree with you.
So aside from her largest strategy to get her readers to see the world through a certain degree through a Christian lens, one of the goals she hoped to accomplish in her fiction once that was done, and you touched on this, was to, quote, show the action of grace in territory held by the devil, the world, in effect. What's the grace that she wrote about? Elaborate on what you said before.
So the grace occurs in characters that, to use a famous word I think you might have just mentioned, or that seem grotesque on the surface, or that are freaks, as she would say. It's a grace that cuts in her language, like Jesus' sword, that it cuts before it heals. Right. So this is not a gentle grace. You don't read O'Connor for Christian consolation, you might say, right? You read O'Connor to be challenged.
Right.
So the grace here is thoroughly a Catholic sacramental grace. It occurs in the physical reality, but it's a reality that, because of the fallenness of the world, seems to erupt in very violent context, or manifests itself in very violent context.
Which is a reflection of the way it does work.
Oftentimes, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, more often than not. And she wanted to make clear of that. And it's scary, and it's frightening, but it's awakening. It opens your eyes if you have, if you're willing to. It really does in our work.
Yes.
And anyway, and you talked about this. Grace comes in violently, not softly. But another aspect of grace, and tell me if you agree, that she manifested in her work, is, as Catholics believe, grace is something that you can accept when offered or reject.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And in her work, grace is offered to characters all the time in every work. Some accept it, some reject it, and some, as you mentioned earlier, you can see that it was offered, but you don't know yet what their choice will be. Yes. And I wonder if quickly you could give us an example from her work of somebody who accepts it, somebody who rejects it, and somebody, well, you kind of did that with the Misfits. Maybe another example is somebody who's been offered it, but the jury's still out.
Yes. Mr. Shiflet would be the title. Is
it's The Life You Saved Maybe Your Own.
Maybe Your Own. I can't believe I just blanked on that. Yeah, Mr. Shiflet, he had, depending on how you want to read it, might have been hoodwinked, but knowingly hoodwinked to marry a developmentally disabled daughter of a land owner. He himself is homeless, and he has the opportunity at the end to make that marriage real, but then he chooses to drive away.
Right. He's offered, he fixes the family car, and the mother of the young woman, who's also lovely.
Yes.
Says, well, marry me. Basically said, I'll give you the car if you fix it and you marry my daughter.
Yes.
And we don't know quite sure if Shiflet is shiftless.
Yeah, right. That's a good one. Yeah.
But obviously the name is, but at the end he marries her. He has the opportunity, and he goes to get something to eat, and the waiter says, she's so lovely. She's like an angel.
Yes.
Right. That's no accident.
No.
And he has the choice.
Yes.
And he decides not to accept the grace.
Decides not to accept it. Another possibility of that type of rejection would be the grandfather in A View from the Woods, who, through a series of really tragic circumstances, it's hard to tell because I don't want to give away the story, but he basically kills the only family member that he really loves because his anger so engulfs him. And that's an example of a character who's so worried about his reputation, but also his financial status and also power, that he ends up all of that he ends
powers
up
and principality.
He ends up hurting the only person he really loves in life. So that would be two examples. I think there's some other ones though, and this is more common, where the reader really has to decide. So there's a big debate on the character Raber in one of her novels, the second novel, Violent Bear It Away. There's a moment where he has a choice to, again, stop the killing of a close family member. Again, I don't want to give it away too much, but he doesn't. But then he faints. So is it the start of guilt, which for O'Connor is oftentimes the first sign of on a way to conversion, right? That sense that you are a sinner, that sense that you need grace to heal your imperfections. Or is it the fact that he didn't stop the killing, mean that he rejects the grace? It's hard to tell, and that's the reader's choice, I think.
And a couple of examples quickly of who accepts it, because we want to let the reader know there's a lot of material here that they should really go to.
Yes,
I have two. I mean, the protagonists of the two novels,
absolutely.
And Marion Tarwater.
Young
Both of these people were running away from grace the whole time.
Yes.
And then at the end, in her usual kind of violent way, they come to accept it, right? Am I right about
Absolutely. I 100% agree with you. And what's so fascinating about the two you just mentioned is that Hazel Motes and Wiseblood is the typical, I'm an atheist, I'm going to construct my own morality, makes the conversion, maybe more the classic kind of conversion technique. But young Tarwater, Marion Tarwater, what's interesting, he's raised to believe in God and he's raised to be a prophet, but he doesn't want to believe in incarnation. He doesn't want to believe in sacramentality that requires a belief in Jesus. And he tries to run from his vocation as a prophet. It's not quite a move from atheism. It's a move from God is not who I want God to be.
That's right.
It's God is who God calls me to be. It's that sense of vocation.
Right. Now, you like grace, and you touched on this. Mystery is another one of the big concepts in all of her work. She mentions it all the time, not only in her fiction, but in her nonfiction. Mystery is fundamental. What is mystery for her?
Mystery is, I'm going to have to reference a theologian who lived at the same time as Flannery O'Connor, but I think she would agree with 100%. Mystery for the theologian Carl Reiner was not something like a scientific mystery where you break it down and you try to figure it out and then you can explain it and then the mystery is solved. Mystery for her is divine mystery. It's entering into the participation in divine life, which is unending and infinite. So the concrete, finite world is always set against this world of divinity, where where the reality is transcendent, and we can never fully grasp it with the human intellect. So it's always something that eludes but invites.
That's a very nice way to put it. Boy, that's terrific.
Well, I think that's O'Connor's way.
Yeah, and that's the way she manifests it. Yeah. Moving on, for time's sake, before she was identified as a Catholic primarily, she was and still is identified equally as a Southerner.
Yes.
Talk about the importance of the South and of her Southernness to her work.
Absolutely central. Even when she was in Connecticut working on her first novel, Wise Blood, I always have to give it, because she's actually lived in Richfield, to be exact. She was writing about the South. It was never outside of her fiction. The handful of stories that she sets in New York City are still about Southerners who, through circumstances against their will, find themselves in New York City. For her, the best way to, as you would say, through the mystery, as you pointed out, through the mystery, is through the concrete. And that requires a writer to be able to depict and know a region very, very well. And also we should, of course, there's the practical side of it, which is that once she was diagnosed with lupus, she had to stay home. And so she would leave home for trips, speaking engagements, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But most of the people in her day-to-day life were Southerners. And there's one other thing that I think is really important that a lot of people miss. It's not just a source of inspiration for her, although it was that. It was also the fact that for her, the South and the U.S. was the only region of the country that still had the basic theological frame that there was a fall and that human beings are in need of redemption. So that famous phrase, the South might not be Christ-centered, but it is Christ-haunted. There's still those residencies. Doesn't mean the Christianity was perfect. It could also be a sort of a lukewarm, like I keep using that word, lukewarm kind of milquetoast cultural Christianity, but it still had that basic theological frame in its culture, despite all the problems with segregation and the Civil War and slavery. She didn't deny any of that, but it still had that basic frame.
You know, that might be part of the answer to the next question that I have for you, which I've asked myself over the years. You know, these fundamentalist or folk Christians, as some call them, that she wrote about, couldn't be more different than Catholic Christians, right? In their obsessiveness, in their isolated view of Christianity, and their total, they could care less about things like tradition or liturgy. How was she able to manifest her Catholic faith through these kinds of Christians in her work?
Yes, it's so fascinating that this is the creative side. She takes these, what you might call backwaters prophets or people that maybe would be written off as white trash by some in her culture, but they have sincere faith, and they sincerely believe that the human beings are not self-sufficient. They need that intrusion of God in their lives. They need to have a life that's human-centered. So when you mentioned Violent Bear Away, that's the perfect example of it. Here's these two characters, young Tarwater and old Tarwater, who are, to use a probably a terrible phrase, Bible-beating Christians. They have no sense of church, no sense of liturgy, but bizarrely, they have this sacramental imagination. The old Tarwater, he hungers for the bread of life. And there's all this beautiful Eucharistic theology at the end when young Tarwater has this sort of final vision. And on top of that, there's the sense of baptism. The young Tarwater has to baptize someone that he doesn't want to baptize, which is very strange culturally, because in the cultural Christianity, or not the cultural Christianity, the Christianity of that at that time, if you were somebody like young Tarwater, you would get baptized once you embraced Christianity and dedicate your life to Jesus. But the person he has to baptize can't do that because they're developmentally disabled. Right. So here's this Catholic theology of baptism underneath this very fundamentalist rural Protestantism. It's a fascinating synthesis.
Yeah, it is. Now moving on, when we talk about O'Connor's southernness and how critical it was in her writing, we're compelled to ask about her views on race and racism, right?
Oh, sure.
The O'Connor scholar, or Ralph Wood, which we both know, has said that for O'Connor, race was, quote, the curse of the South, the single most important test which Christians failed, and that for her, quote, the mistreatment of blacks was a violation of their being creatures made in the image of God. On the other hand, over the years, she's been criticized for her use of the N-word in her fiction. What was her view of race and racism, and what was her justification or rationale for the use of the N-word in her fiction?
Well, let's talk purely from a literary standpoint of view, right? If she's writing about racist white characters of the 1950s and early 60s and the civil rights movement is just starting, they, and their speaking, would have been dropping the N-word all over the place. And so in some ways it's a sense of literary accuracy to the characters. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is that O'Connor knew that she had to recover or get over her own inbred racism just from being raised in the South. Yeah. So there's a story that she tells where she was on a bus. This was before they were integrated. And the bus driver was extraordinarily aggressive and rude to a black passenger. And she said witnessing that was the moment that she became an integrationist. That said, she supported integration, but she wanted it to be a little bit more of a gradual approach. So she probably would not have upheld, say, something like what you would have saw in Martin Luther King Jr., like the letter of Birmingham jail, where, this thing about we keep wait, just tell us to wait is not going to ever cut it. So she can certainly be criticized. And of course, even later in life, when she started to work on her racism through her stories and write these really anti-racist short stories, that didn't mean she didn't still drop the N-word in letters and et cetera, et cetera. Sure. So it's very complicated. But I like what Alice Walker said, the great African-American novelist. Alice Walker, who grew up near Milledgeville, so knew the O'Connor family, says, O'Connor was a racist, but her stories are not essentially about race. What they're most essentially about is pride and humanity and all the fallenness of human nature. Wow. So you have to hold the tension in your mind, I think, when you read O'Connor. Yeah.
Interesting. In Wildcat, the recent feature film about O'Connor, there's a scene where one of her fellow writers advises her not to use the N-word in her fiction because she's going to get in trouble. And in that conversation, she says the following lines. She said more, but these are the ones that I picked out from the conversation. She says, kind of buttress what she said, no one I write about would use any other word but that.
Exactly.
She says, I prefer not to tidy up reality. And then she says, and the truth does not change according to your ability to stomach it.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure those are her actual words transposed by the filmmaker Ethan Hawke into this scene.
Yes.
But regardless, that's a pretty faithful representation of her thinking on this, right?
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. You have to be truthful as an author. Now, for her, that truth was always set against this Catholic belief. But an artist that shies away from truth is somehow failing in their vocation. That doesn't mean that they always are going to be perfect at it. But for her, that's what the art form she would say, required.
Right, and she says you can't. In a talk that she gave to aspiring young writers whose stories she had read before she gave the talk, she basically chastised them for having their idiom, as she called it, be so generic that, as she said, they could be from anywhere, which means that they were from nowhere. They were not real people, and you can't convey a story without creating real people. And that was the essence of her argument on that.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Now, to close on this issue, because I had a conversation with a friend of mine, an African American Catholic writer, a passionate lover of Flannery O'Connor, and he told me he was talking about the film. He told me that he thinks that the best argument against identity politics that he's ever seen is the story Everything That Rises Must Converge, because in it, he says, the person who appears to be the most racist because of the things that she says ends up being, in fact, the least racist, while those who profess, who mouth the anti-racist words, if you see through their actions that they're really pretty racist.
They are.
And he says, it's a Catholic, it's a Christian point of view to see beneath the surface. To see the common humanity, like the grandmother did in the end. Do you think that's an accurate or fairly accurate reading of that story?
I think it's a really wonderful reading of the story. I think when she mentioned that story in her letter, she said, "This is my a plague on both your houses" story. That the racist mother is obviously racist, and she has her own moment of rude awakening when she does the little sort of, say, passive aggressiveness to the boy gives him the coin, and then the mother standing right there, just how condescending that is. But the more progressive character, the one you're referring to, that is supposed to be anti-racist, is full of his own blindness. Yeah. And he's using his supposed anti-racism more to just, shall we say, anger his mother. Right. So it's not even very sincere. And so then, of course, once she, again, I don't want to give too much away, but then he has these, the last few lines of that story are so well written. Yeah. There's these waves of guilt that are about to wash over him.
Julian, and he's the son of the woman, and you can see the transformation in the possibility of a harsh and dreadful grace having its effect. Yes. Beautiful. It's my favorite story of all time from anybody.
It's one of my favorites.
I have to say it. I have to say.
Yes.
I mentioned Wildcat, the recent film about O'Connor, which was directed by Ethan Hawke and stars his daughter Maya, who's also the daughter of Uma Thurman, and she does a wonderful job.
She does.
But when I was before I saw it, I was prepared not to like it, because I'd heard that the Catholic content of her life and work had been leached out, and I believed it because that's what Hollywood has been doing for the last couple of decades, for films like this. But I saw it and I thought, that's not it at all.
Right.
I was so amazed at how serious and how sensitively I think they touched on the importance of her Catholic faith in this film, particularly in this one scene where Flannery is bedridden. With lupus, she that often happened, and she's talking to the family priest, who's played by Liam Neeson, beautifully.
It's excellent.
And then that conversation, again, so sensitively touches on many of the things we've talked about so far, and more about the importance, about what Catholic faith means, about the importance of it to her in her life. Because she struggles, she wants to be a good Catholic. How do I do that? And she doesn't think she can. And is her writing kind of anti-Catholic because it's violent? And they have the conversation about the things, about grace is violent, grace is problem, grace doesn't come in easy, mystery. And then he says to her, "Is your writing honest?" And she says, "Yes." Well, that's the way to get things to it. It's beautiful. What's your take on the film? Because I know you saw it overall.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I had the exact same fear, you might say, that they were going to downplay or even take out entirely the Catholic side. But they dove right into it. I mean, so many of the voiceovers are from her prayer journal, which is a journal that was unpublished for years, but that has now been published. which she wrote when she was a graduate student at Iowa. And it's amazing to see somebody 21 or so put the question of vocation and her relationship to God front and center with her work. And so I love that they integrated that in, because it very clearly demonstrates you can't separate that from O'Connor. You can't ignore the Catholic question, and you can't just take it out. So I was really thrilled, and that is a wonderful scene.
Yeah. It's worth the price of just that scene.
It is.
So do you think that the fact that a film like this is made in this age, the post-Christian, in large part anti-Christian era of ours, do you think that's a sign, not only that O'Connor's work will survive and thrive because it's so good that it is bound to, no matter what, but that the importance of the spiritual element, the importance of faith, and of the things that the Catholic faith bring, that it's not going to be shunted away like so many people want it. It's not going to be interpreted as hate speech or hate crimes. That it does still resonate and it could still change lives.
I hope so. I hope that wasn't just a fluke of Maya Hawke's and Ethan Hawke's passion for O'Connor. But we will see. I hope that she continues to be taught. But a lot of that has to do with, how people deal with this sensitive question of her language and her stories. And it really will require not just readers, but teachers to be able to handle complexity. But I think as a Catholic, we should embrace her wholeheartedly because she is, I would say, probably the greatest American Catholic fiction writer, at least until, and maybe another one comes along, I don't know. But at least as far as I would, if I had to nominate one person, it would definitely be her. And again, it's just the powerful sacramental imagination she has. I think she calls Catholic readers to deal with complexity. And I think that's something to embrace and not shy away from.
Well, as will come to no surprise to people who have been listening, my gushing over her, she's been very important in my life. Ever since I started reading her in 1970 with Professor Lawrence Cunningham, who became the head of the religion department at Notre Dame, but he was a professor at Florida State University. She made me shift my view of life. And she made me rethink about the Catholic faith. It waxed and waned over the years.
Sure.
But whenever I go back to her, and I go back to her often, it rekindles. And it
Absolutely.
When did you first encounter O'Connor? And what effect did it have on you when you first did? And what effect did it have on your Catholic faith and how you view the world?
Well, if I'm going to answer the first part of the question, honestly, I would say my reaction was mystification. I had no idea what the story's about. I picked them up from a local library in, I think, my mid-20s, just because I knew she was Catholic. I knew that she was very acclaimed. So I was just curious. And I didn't know what to make of them, honestly. I found a lot of them very unpleasant. And now that I teach O'Connor once in a while, I can say that is a common reaction. Right? It is a very common reaction. For me, the moment of conversion was studying with Dr. Mark Bosco at Loyola Chicago, where I did my doctorate work, and also the Temple of the Holy Ghost, because that's the only one where the character is explicitly Catholic.
Yeah.
So I think I was able to connect to that because of that. But it's a very atypical story. So I don't know if that would necessarily be the one that I would recommend for quintessential O'Connor.
Right.
But again, if you are somebody who is Catholic, I would certainly recommend that because it puts the Eucharistic symbolism front and center.
Yeah. So what is, you think, is there one lesson or two or three lessons, principal lessons that you think that Catholic readers today could learn from her work?
To see grace in places where it seems almost impossible to see it, amongst people that would maybe at first blush be people you would want nothing to do with. Maybe they would come across as uneducated or culturally marginalized or whatever description you want to say. So, for example, in that story, Temple of the Holy Ghost, it's somebody described as a, quote, freak, unquote, and he's forced to work at a circus as a sideshow attraction, basically. So he's demeaned so much and to be more or less naked most of the time and when he performs. It's a very demeaning job, but it's actually an avenue of grace for the character, for the 12-year-old protagonist. And so, because he has they have a broken body, I should say. They're actually an intersex person. So that amazing way that O'Connor encourages us to see grace where we don't want to see it. I think that would be the thing that I would call people to do.
So, you said that you would say that O'Connor was the or one of the great Catholic writers of our time. Ralph Wood, who I referenced before, the Baylor professor of religion and literature, and an O'Connor scholar, has gone more further. He says she is the only great Christian writer that this nation has ever produced. Bold statement.
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
Well, I've read Wood's work, and I don't want to. I mean, he's one of the great scholars of O'Connor. I am a little surprised he said that because the word "only" is troubling for me, especially because it sort of downplays Walker Percy, who was Catholic's contemporary and fellow Catholic and fellow Southerner. I think I would absolutely say O'Connor, for me personally, is the greatest American. I wouldn't say she's the only one. And the reason why I would hesitate to say that is because I want to encourage people to seek out all the great Catholic novels that have been written in this country, especially since O'Connor's death. So Ron Hansen's Married in Ecstasy, or Alice McDermott's The Ninth Hour. So I hesitate to go as far as that, go that far. But but certainly for me, she's my favorite. Yeah.
So you touched on the stories that maybe people should start if somebody listening to us hasn't read Flannery O'Connor, but because of our incredible eloquence, have decided that it's about time that they should read Flannery O'Connor, how should they start? What do you recommend?
I actually posed this to her elderly cousin one time, who had the honor to meet, Louise Florencourt, and I think her recommendation is spot on. You should read Revelation. You see the sacramental vision, you see the conversion through an act of violence. Although it's for O'Connor, it's a pretty mild act of violence. Right. You see the mystical side of her writing. So I would recommend that. I do think to start with O'Connor, you should start with the short stories. So Everything Arises Must Converge, absolutely. Good Man is Hard to Find. It's probably her most famous, so I would definitely move that. And then I would throw out one that doesn't get as much attention, maybe Parker's Back, which is this wonderful example of a Catholic sacramental imagination and characters that have no cultural connection with it. But it ends up with a character tattooing an icon, which is so Catholic and so Eastern Orthodox, right? Yeah. So those would be the ones I'd recommend.
So definitely the stories first, the novels later.
Novels, yes, especially not Wise Blood. I would not recommend Wise Blood first.
Yeah, it's funny. Yeah. That was the first thing she published, I think, right? All right. Well, Dr. Little, that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I always love talking about Flannery O'Connor. I particularly enjoyed this conversation with you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Honor.